I'm Brittany Harden-Tangway, a senior manager with KPMG, and I am fascinated by the practice of transfer pricing and its impact on the global market. Join me each episode as I explore the transfer pricing world with specialists who will explain the ins and outs of this niche practice where tax meets economics.
Hi, everyone. I'm Seth Salinger, a manager in transfer pricing in the Minneapolis office, and I'm the editor of the Transfer Pricing Podcast. Today, we have a special two-part episode with Brittany talking to transfer pricing professionals at our TP Minds West Coast Conference. She's going to dive into the subject of how GenAI and transfer pricing intersect with each other.
Today, we're diving into a transformative topic that's reshaping how multinationals approach their value chains, generative AI, and its impact on transfer pricing strategies. Now, we've talked about Gen AI as a technology in the past and how it may impact the way you actually run your tax department or how you think about your transfer pricing and how you implement those things along the way. But what we're going to be looking at today is a little bit of a different take. Instead, how is Gen AI ultimately impacting your value chain and what your company is actually doing? And then what are and should be those intended follow-on effects that will ultimately impact your transfer pricing. And so, as we know, this is a technology that is rapidly changing the business landscape. And I am very thrilled to have join with me today Lonnie Brist, who is a senior managing director in KPMG's Washington National Tax Practice with almost 30 years of transfer pricing experience, and a lot of it on the West Coast where he resides and spends a lot of his time looking at technology companies. So welcome, Lonnie. Thank you so much for being here with me.
Well, happy to be here, Brittany.
We happen to be together at the TP Minds West Coast Conference in Palo Alto. And we had the opportunity to hear from a number of different participants at that conference, some of their thoughts, their questions, and different considerations that need to be kept in mind when it comes to how Gen AI is ultimately going to impact the value chain and then what that might look like for transfer pricing going forward. So we have a number of collected clips. We're going to listen to them together, and Lonnie and I are going to react. I'm excited to go on this journey with you. So thank you, Lonnie, again for being here.
Absolutely, Brittany. I'm looking forward to diving in.
All right, so we're going to listen to our first clip, and this should present us a little bit about how we should think about Gen AI and its contribution for IP creation. So let's take a listen.
I think it just depends on how Gen AI is being used in the business. Is it more of just making work more efficient, or is it creating new IP? Or are you building a Gen AI framework, basically? And that could be constituted as IP.
All right, so Lonnie, I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
The excellent point about AI and just the question of whether it is IP or not. And I'd say anytime we have intellectual property, whether it be AI or other types of IP, it's all about the control of development, the control of the ownership, and the ability to exploit it in the way that you'd like. And with that, the mere fact of knowing that Gen AI could create intellectual property, and you might have some profits from that intellectual property, suggests that maybe one should structure your intercompany agreements so that the development is undertaken in a way that you have desired to undertake it. It's funded by those who desire to fund it, and the resulting right to that intellectual property is in the location that one desires. It's actually quite important to think about how broad could that intellectual property be. Some might say it is simply of the development, maybe the underlying software could be one aspect. Other might be the data that might train such Gen AI models. And I would say anything that has the potential to generate or to create that intellectual property would be worthwhile to include in the consideration of getting it in the right place while it's being developed, getting it in the right place prior to exploitation.
We don't know the breadth entirely of where it could be, but depending on how it ultimately gets used and deployed, we do have existing samples, things that have been tested by various tax authorities and jurisdictions. But it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, and then how do you prepare for that adequately?
When I think about what is really in Gen AI, it is really software that is generating incremental software or incremental analytics.
Mhm.
And when you think about the overall contribution, there is, well, it might come down to a question: who developed the initial software? Who's responsible for developing that? The underlying technology that creates or generates the analytics, undertakes those analytics, or is responsible for generating new software. And so it doesn't change the underlying fundamental about what is IP. It just might go back to who developed the original IP that enables that ongoing development.
And that's interesting because then you could trace it all the way back.
When
Yeah.
I think about the use of third party software, that third party has already received arm's length compensation for that. So
Right.
then it's a question: which company or which entity acquired that third party software, and which company is exploiting that third party software? And so then it's a question of what further did one do with that, and how did they utilize it, and how did they exploit it? I would actually go back to an earlier point too, and you mentioned about the original developer of that software, and it sometimes conjures up the view that maybe the life of this IP could be materially longer than what we typically think IP life to be, potentially even into perpetuity. And I would argue this doesn't change the perpetuity discussion. There is still a renewal or a refreshing regeneration of software over time. And it might feed on prior software, but the view that it is indefinite, I think, still faces the same scrutiny. It's a question of how often or what is the rate of change of the underlying algorithms, the underlying code. So I think life of the IP is still a question that must be addressed as we think about AI.
Yeah. There's so much to go down here, but we've got lots of clips to listen to. And so let's go ahead and listen to the next one because I agree that first instance is the big question that we're trying to ask, but the devil's going to be in the details when it comes to all of this. And so let's listen to our next clip and maybe we'll have an opportunity to get a little bit more specific.
One of the follow-on effects I'm thinking about is how GenAI could change the way costs are allocated. In our transfer pricing, we typically use headcount as an allocation key for management services, but will that still tell the full story?
Lonnie, that's an interesting point, thinking about the intercompany transactions of service fees and how Gen AI fits into that, and maybe considering allocation keys as a new thing that needs to be reconsidered as a result of this technology. What are your thoughts?
Service allocations are always an interesting topic. And I think maybe just to set the stage, as I think about it, would be typically IP related expenses are not allocated out, as usually an IP owner will retain those and license that IP out separately. So I guess when we start to think about the AI expenses in an allocation, what we're really thinking about is, well, how should that expense be allocated to the various recipients or the owners of that IP? And are they getting a reasonable share of those expense to correspond with the overall value that they expect to get from that?
Obviously, IP is one part of the conversation. I mean, thinking about the larger theme of this episode of what we're trying to consider and the topic of how Gen AI impacts your value chain. I mean, the characterization of what these different transactions are and how those should be treated, I guess that's probably where this falls into because there are costs that come with using Gen AI in whatever capacity your business is. And that's going to change based on what your industry is and whether you are a hyperscaler who's actually trying to make this technology available. How does that get treated differently? But thinking further down the road for everyday companies that may just be using Gen AI, if Gen AI is reducing headcount in the way that we anticipate it to in some of these back office services, then previously, it was very easy to use headcount as an allocation key to see like, oh, how much work is being done by IT, but per person per username. And is that still going to be true?
I think that's a good question. And as you think about if it truly does replace people, Is it the requirement of a company to allocate an expense there with the assumption that that activity is done on the ground in that country? That seems like a peculiar answer to me. But at the end of the day, it's like, well, what is it that we are performing and which entity performed that? And it's possible that merely with AI, you might enable that activity to be sourced or performed by yet a different entity than it might have originally been done by.
Yeah. As you were saying that, it made me think that's the type of transition within a business that could be easily overlooked and maybe forgotten about from a transfer pricing perspective until it's too late. It may say, oh, we no longer have this person doing it, but not thinking of the fact that the same function and activity that is being provided cross-border between different entities is now being lifted and shifted as opposed to being done by an individual. It's being done by technology. It's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, and as we keep that in mind, it's interesting because it suggests that maybe the technology that is undertaking that activity could be performed in yet a different country. It says something about what the return might be in that original country. If less functions are being done on the ground, it might mean the return to that entity could be lower. And so I think generally, when you look across the tax landscape, I would say most countries and their tax authorities have the view that profit in countries should only increase or remain the same. But if AI is enabling that activity to be performed outside of the jurisdiction, it's not at least obvious to me why profit would remain the same. Maybe there's a reallocation of profit to where the activity ultimately took place.
Yeah. Oh gosh, there's a lot to unpack there because then if it changes the value of an activity, then yeah, the returns that you were potentially used to experiencing or getting, all of it has to be revisited. You have to really kind of
Yeah.
reevaluate where is the value actually being created and driven here.
I fully concur that it should be revisited. And I think there's maybe one important aspect to ponder here, and that is when is the right time to revisit? And I know that if you do not revisit it, usually somebody else revisits it for you. And when you think about the global controversy world that we live in, it would probably be advantageous for us as companies, as taxpayers, to revisit our value chain in advance of a tax authority so that we have a view of precisely where we believe the value is coming from and what arguments we have or what positions we have so that we know what we should be defending.
Yeah, that's a great reminder. Reducing expenses always seems like a good idea, but if it changes the return, especially when you're a large, more complicated structure, a local tax authority will notice if year over year, all of a sudden, the returns they were used to getting, you've reduced it to such an extent.
Hello, Seth here again. Hope you enjoyed that episode. Please stay tuned for the next one.
Thanks for joining me on this adventure in transfer pricing. See you next time.